On the coldest night of that winter, on a crumbling stretch of Delancey Street in South Philadelphia, a man in a torn coat sat on the stone steps of an old church, and every single person who walked past him looked away. What none of them knew, and what he himself wouldn't understand until it nearly destroyed him, was that this shivering, hollow-eyed stranger begging the world for one kind glance was August Drabeck, the most feared crime boss the city's docks had ever known, a man whose whispered name could turn hardened dock workers pale, who could end a life with a single phone call and never lose 1 minute of sleep. That night he'd stripped away the tailored suits and the bodyguards and the empire built on fear, and he'd walked out into the very streets he was about to dismantle, wanting to feel just once what it was like to be one of the nobodies he was preparing to crush, and the city gave him his answer. For hours the well-fed and the comfortable stepped around him like he was a stain on the sidewalk, until he'd nearly convinced himself that people are cold all the way down, that his cruelty had been right all along. And then she stopped. Raya Voss, 27 years old, 7 months pregnant, a widowed nurse with newspaper stuffed into her broken shoes. A woman who'd buried her firefighter husband before he ever learned he was going to be a father, who hadn't eaten a real meal in 3 days because she was saving every scrap for the child growing inside her. She had exactly one thing left in this world, half a loaf of bread and a small carton of milk she'd bought with her very last dollar, milk she'd been saving for her baby. And she sat down beside this ragged stranger nobody else would touch, and she broke it in half and she gave it to him. She who had nothing, gave. He who secretly had everything, took. But here's the part that would eventually bring the darkest man in Philadelphia to his knees. The part he wouldn't discover for weeks. She knew. From the moment her fingers brushed the old scar on his left cheek, she knew exactly who he was, because 6 years earlier, in a hospital nobody talks about anymore, she'd been the one who put that scar there. She knew he was the man about to throw her out onto the street, and she gave him her last meal anyway. This is the story of the night the cruelest man in the city was saved by the one person he was about to ruin. If this story moves you even a little, do us a small kindness in return and tap that like button, share it with someone who still believes people can change, and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Now let's go back to that freezing church step, and to the woman who had nothing and gave anyway. 3 weeks before that night, when the dawn fog still lay over the port of Philadelphia like a gray burial shroud, a black car rolled slowly through the iron gate of warehouse number 7. And every man unloading cargo there, men with calloused hands and eyes that seemed afraid of nothing on this earth, lowered his head at once and looked down at the tips of his own shoes. No one told them to. No one needed to tell them to. On this stretch of harbor, people learned very early that there were certain things you shouldn't look straight at, just as people didn't look straight into the sun, and at the top of that list was the man who had just stepped out of that black car. August Drabeck was 34 years old, built as large and solid as a piling beneath a pier, his black hair cut short, and already touched with silver at both temples though he was still young, as if time itself aged faster when it had to live inside his head. His face was angular and motionless, as though carved from gray stone, with a faint scar running diagonally across his left cheekbone, a cleanly healed mark stitched so skillfully that it looked almost like a fold in the skin. And his eyes. People said those eyes had the color of harbor steel in January, a coldness so deep that when he looked at someone long enough, that person would begin to wonder what he'd done wrong, even when he hadn't done anything wrong at all. But the strangest thing about August Drabeck, the thing that set him apart from every boss who had ever ruled this line of docks, was that almost no one had ever seen his face. He didn't appear in photographs. He didn't go to parties. He gave orders through 3 layers of intermediaries, through voices on telephones and scraps of paper burned the moment they were read. And so, to the thousands of people living beneath his dominion, the name Drabeck wasn't a man but a force, like the tide or winter, something you didn't need to see in order to fear. The workers who bowed their heads that morning didn't bow because they recognized him. They bowed because of the black car, because of the way the warehouse doors opened by themselves, because of the way the air along the docks seemed to thicken, and if any one of them had dared to look up at the man in the gray overcoat, he would only have thought he was one of the organization's lawyers or accountants. Drabeck's face was a rumor, a legend, and legends don't have portraits. He walked through the heart of the warehouse with unhurried steps, past mountains of crates he owned, trucks without license plates that he owned, men holding their breath who, in a certain sense, he owned as well, and he didn't look at any of it because a man didn't need to look at what already belonged to him. His office was on the top floor of warehouse number 7, a broad room with glass windows looking straight out over the dark water of the Delaware River, where container ships drifted past slowly like giant beasts that had been tamed. People said that from this room, with nothing more than a nod, Drabeck had once brought an entire union to its knees, had once erased a rival gang from the city map without leaving a single line in the newspapers. And those stories might have been true, or they might have been false, but no one was foolish enough to find out. That morning, just as he had sat down behind the polished black oak desk, the office door opened after exactly one knock, and Wendell Krause stepped inside. Wendell had been his right hand for 5 years now, a man past 40 with pale blonde hair carefully combed back, a suit always pressed more sharply than necessary, and a smile that always appeared half a second sooner than anything natural. Wendell was the kind of useful man who was almost perfect, quick, thorough, never needing an order repeated a second time. But there was one small thing that anyone sharp enough would notice about him, and that was that Wendell never fully sat down in a chair when he was in this room, and never stood more than 3 steps away from the door, as if he were always preparing for something, or guarding himself against something, though no one knew which. That morning Wendell held a thick brown file against his chest, and when he placed it on the oak desktop, he set it down gently and almost tenderly, as if presenting a precious gift. "The Delancey project, sir," he said, his voice smooth as machine oil. "Everything is ready. All it needs now is your signature. The partners on the other side are growing impatient. They say that parcel of land is the final link, and they're willing to pay even more if we hand it over early, before the end of the month." Drabeck didn't answer at once. He looked at the file lying on the desk, that ordinary brown weight of paper, and for one very brief moment, so brief that even he didn't register it, something touched a place very deep inside him, like a finger tapping against the thick ice of a lake that had long been frozen shut. Then the moment passed. He reached out, drew the file closer, opened the cover, and began to read about the street he was about to wipe from the face of the earth, the street called Delancey, where 3 weeks later, on the coldest night of winter, his life would be snapped in 2 by half a loaf of bread. That night, when the entire harbor had sunk into the kind of thick darkness torn open only by a few floodlights on the distant cranes, the office on the highest floor of warehouse number 7 was still lit, or rather, only a single desk lamp remained, spilling a pale yellow pool of light over the oak surface, and inside that pool of light, the brown file lay open like a wound. August Drabeck sat alone. He had sent everyone home many hours earlier, Wendell included, because he had a habit of reading important contracts in absolute silence, the kind of silence that only rooms sitting higher than every human noise could possess, and in the past 15 years, that habit had never betrayed him. The Delancey plan had been drafted with a neatness worthy of praise. 16 pages, not one unnecessary word. The entire old row of streets running along the edge of the harbor would be cleared within 90 days. The outstanding debts of the small merchants in the area would be called in all at once, a coordinated squeeze calculated so that no one would have time to find a way out. The tenants would receive notices terminating their leases, with the shortest deadline the law still allowed, and after that the bulldozers would come. On paper, everything was only numbers. 42 households, 11 shops, a laundromat that had been running for 3 generations, a small diner 8 months overdue on its debt. Drabeck skimmed through all of it with the speed of a man who had read hundreds of plans just like this, and his steel-colored eyes slid across those lines as calmly as if they were moving over a cargo manifest, because that was exactly how he had taught himself to see the world long ago, that everything was merchandise, every person was a line in a ledger, and any man who let those lines turn into faces wouldn't survive a single winter in this line of work. Page 13 was the list of residents. He scanned down the column, the names following one another as evenly as railroad ties. House number 3, house number 5, house number 9, the flower shop, the shoe repair shop, the boarding house at number 14 with the note that tenant R. Voss was pregnant, and 2 months behind on rent, house number 16, house number 18, and his eyes kept drifting down toward the bottom of the page. Only somewhere along the way, for reasons he didn't understand, the rhythm of his reading stumbled slightly, as lightly as a wheel rolling over a small pebble on smooth asphalt, so lightly that even he didn't bother to look back and see what that pebble had been. He turned to page 14. Delivery terms, page 15. Profit distribution. The numbers on this page were large enough to buy out an entirely different neighborhood, large enough that anyone in his world would have signed at once without reading, and Drabeck understood that better than anyone, because this deal wasn't simply money. It was the link that would let his organization step fully into another tier, where old money was dressed in new clothes and no one asked where it had come from anymore. This was the kind of signature every father of every underground empire dreamed of placing on paper. The door opened after a knock, and Wendell stepped in with 2 cups of coffee on a tray, though no one had called for coffee. "I saw the light was still on," he said, the smile arriving half a second before the words as usual. "So I assumed you were looking over Delancey." "The partners sent another message tonight, sir. They're asking whether they might receive the signed copy this week." He set the coffee cup down at the edge of the desk, close enough to appear thoughtful, far enough not to trespass into the lamp's pool of light, and then he added in that carefully polished, courteous voice of his, so courteous that only a truly sharp ear could hear the tiny thorn hidden under the velvet. "That, of course, no one would dare rush you. Only in this business. You often taught me that opportunity is like the tide. It doesn't wait too long for any man standing on the shore." Drabeck didn't lift his head. He reached for the fountain pen lying to the right of the file, the heavy black silver pen he had used to sign contracts that had decided the fate of more streets than he could still remember. And he uncapped it, and the gleaming gold nib stopped above the blank line at the bottom of page 16, where all it would take was a streak of ink lasting less than 3 seconds for those 42 households to cease existing on anyone's map. The nib hovered there, 1 second, 2 seconds. In the silent room, there was only the vague sound of river water beating somewhere far below, and Wendell stood exactly 3 steps from the door, holding his breath as he waited for that stroke of ink, but it didn't fall. Drabeck capped the pen again, the sound of metal fitting into metal dry and hard as a bullet being removed from its chamber. Then he set the pen down on the desktop, neat and straight, parallel with the edge of the file, and said in the low, level voice of a man who had never had to speak loudly in his life, "Tomorrow." Wendell stood still for one more beat, the smile on his face not fading, though something behind it had just dropped like a curtain. Then he bowed his head and said, "Yes, sir. Tomorrow is fine too," and withdrew, closing the door so softly it made no sound. Left alone, Drabeck sat motionless in the yellow pool of light, looking at the closed file, and he couldn't explain, nor did he care to explain, why the hand that had signed orders wiping out so many things in his life had just refused to obey him on this particular night, for the sake of a ruined little street he had never even set foot on. The news came at noon the following day, slipping through 3 layers of intermediaries like every other piece of news, before finally landing on August Drabeck's desk as a few dry-typed lines, stating that a man named Emmett Corrigan, the owner of the small diner in Delancey, the man whose name appeared on the list of debts 8 months overdue, had been found at Pier No. 9 at dawn, and he was gone. The report said that the collection crew had gone to his diner 3 times the previous week, and on the last visit they had taken away the industrial refrigerator and the tables and chairs, the last things of value left in that little eating place that had stood for nearly 20 years, and they had informed him that Friday was the final deadline. He hadn't waited until Friday. To Drabeck, reports like this were nothing new. In 15 years in the business, he had read enough sheets of paper like that to understand that the profession he had chosen was much like the river outside. Every now and then it took someone away, and the man who stood at the head of the river wasn't allowed to look too long at whatever drifted past. So he meant only to fold the report closed as he had folded hundreds before it, had it not been for the note at the bottom of the page, stating that the deceased had left behind a sealed letter, and on the envelope were exactly 5 words, for Mr. August Drabeck. He stared at that line for a very long time. In his world, no one wrote his name on paper, no one dared. That name was whispered, not written, and yet a poor diner owner from the most ruined neighborhood in the city had written it out in the careful handwriting of a man who had once been properly educated, and that, not the death itself, was what made Drabek's hand slow as he slit open the envelope. The letter was only 1 page, written in ballpoint pen on the back of an old menu from that very diner, and it did not begin with the curse he had expected, nor with the accusations that any man in Corrigan's position had every right to pour down on him, but with 3 words that forced the steel man of the harbor to read them a second time. I thank you. I am writing these lines not to blame you, the letter continued, but to repay the last of a debt you may have forgotten long ago, though I haven't forgotten it for a single day. 11 years ago, my wife Nora fell gravely ill, with the kind of sickness a hospital will only agree to treat once enough money has been placed on the table. And back then I ran all over the city, knocked on every door, knelt before the richest people whose faces I knew, and every one of them looked at me as if I were a puddle of dirty water. Then one morning, the hospital called me and said the entire bill had been paid in advance for the whole course of treatment, by someone who left no name. It took me almost a year to trace who that person was, through an old treasurer who had once worked in your organization, and when I learned it was you, I couldn't believe it, because you had never met me, had never spoken a word to me, and in all the years afterward you never once mentioned it, never once sent anyone to knock on my door and demand gratitude, never once made me bow my head. You gave as if the giving had never happened. My Nora lived 9 more years because of that money. 9 years I considered the greatest gift of my life, and she passed away 2 years ago in peace, never knowing that those years had been bought with money from the man this whole harbor fears. I am telling this story not to beg you to forgive the debt. By now it is far too late for begging. I am telling it because I think you need to know that such a man once existed, a man who paid to save the life of a stranger's wife, and then quietly turned away without asking for a single word of thanks. And that man and the man who ordered my last refrigerator taken away last week carry the same name. I have thought about that through these recent nights, thought about it over and over and still found no answer. You once saved me, then you became the thing that killed me. I don't understand what happened to you, Mr. Drabek, and I honestly hope that somewhere inside, you still remember. The letter ended there, without a signature, only a blurred smear of ink in the lower corner, as if the pen had been set down a long time before the hand could bear to leave it. August Drabek sat motionless behind the oak desk, the old menu held in his hand, and beyond the glass window, the ships were still drifting slowly across the gray river, as if nothing in this world had happened at all. He did not remember Emmett Corrigan. He searched himself and found no face, but he remembered the name Nora, remembered it faintly, the way a man remembers a room from an old dream, some afternoon 11 years earlier, when he had been younger, when someone had told him over a table of liquor about a man selling food who was scrambling to save his wife, and he had quietly done that thing and then forgotten it, truly forgotten it, the way a man forgets a stone thrown into water. Who was the man who had done that? The question rose inside his chest without becoming sound, and with it came something else too, something he had believed for 15 years was long dead, now stirring beneath the ice. He rose from the chair without knowing when he had moved. The room was too large and too silent, the rush of blood in his ears too loud, and before consciousness could intervene, his fist had slammed into the exposed brick wall beside the window, once, and then he stood there gasping, his forehead against the wall, his knuckles split open, dark red blood spreading across the gray brick, and that was the first time in many years August Drabek felt pain somewhere other than his hand. The winter when August Drabek was 19 years old was the longest winter in his memory, and that night, as he stood with his forehead against the brick wall and his knuckles still bleeding, the ice of 15 years suddenly cracked open, and everything came rushing back without permission, without warning, whole and untouched, as if time had never passed at all. Back then, he and his sister lived in an attic apartment in an old building on the north side of the city, an apartment with a window looking out over factory smokestacks and no heater, where winter slipped in through every gap in the floorboards, and the two of them had to lay their coats over the blanket every night to hold on to whatever little warmth remained. Their parents had left the world one after the other, a few years earlier, one from illness, one from exhaustion, leaving 2 children to lean on each other to survive. August worked the night shift unloading goods at the wholesale market, while Mila, his younger sister, 17 years old, took in mending for the entire building to earn a few spare coins at a time. His Mila was a thin girl with large hazel eyes, and a laugh as clear as a spoon touching the side of a glass. And if he had to choose only one thing to remember about her, August would remember how, without a single exception through all those years, she always pushed her portion of food toward her older brother. She said she had already eaten. She said she wasn't hungry. She said girls didn't eat much. You don't know that. And she said those words so naturally that it took August a very long time afterward to understand that his sister had been giving him her whole youth one spoonful at a time, quietly as falling snow. Then, in the middle of that winter, Mila fell ill. At first it was only long coughing spells she hid behind her sleeve. Then the afternoons when she drifted to sleep beside the pile of unfinished mending. Then one morning when she couldn't get up anymore, and after examining her, the old doctor at the end of the street pulled August into the hallway and said, in the voice of a man who had been forced to say that sentence too many times in his life, that her illness could be treated, but it had to be treated at a major hospital, had to be treated at once, and the price of it was a number that a young market porter couldn't gather even if he worked 10 years without stopping. For the next 3 days, August Drabeck walked all over the neighborhood like a sleepwalker, knocking on every door he knew, asking to borrow money from people he barely knew to people whose names he had only heard, and he received every kind of refusal this world had to offer. Some shook their heads with pity. Some made excuses about their own hardship. Some didn't even bother to open the door all the way, only calling through the crack that there was no money in this house before sliding the bolt shut again. And after every closed door, that young man felt the city around him grow a little wider, a little colder, a little more strange. But then, on the afternoon of the 3rd day, it seemed a miracle had come. A wealthy man who lived in the 3-story stone house at the end of the street, a man who owned several rows of rental houses in the area, had heard the story and sent word for the boy to come see him. And when August stood in the warm parlor heated by the fireplace, his hands twisting his old wool hat tight, the man had nodded and said, "Yes, I will lend it to you. That amount isn't much to me. Come back tonight. I need a few hours to prepare it." August had run home as fast as he could to tell Mila, had held her burning hand and told her to hold on. Just tonight, only one more night. Tomorrow morning I'll take you to the hospital. And Mila had smiled at him, a tired smile but still just as clear. Then she had drifted to sleep with the complete faith of a younger sister, who believed her older brother could fix anything in the world. That evening, August returned to the stone house at the appointed hour. The lights inside were still on, a warm yellow glow shining through the thick velvet curtains, and he knocked on the door, and no one answered. He knocked again. He stood waiting on the stone steps, while the night wind began to howl along the row of houses, telling himself perhaps the man was busy. Perhaps he hadn't heard, and he kept knocking, spaced apart, polite, patient, because he had no other choice left in the world besides this door, because behind him the whole city had already shaken its head, and in front of him was the only lit window that still held out a promise. Snow began to fall around midnight. He saw a shadow moving faintly behind the curtains, saw the light shift from the parlor to the upstairs bedroom, and still he stood there, both feet slowly losing feeling inside his worn-soled shoes, his breath freezing into white smoke before his face, his knocking growing softer with each passing hour, not because he had given up, but because his fingers had gone stiff in the cold and no longer obeyed him. He stood on another man's porch through that winter night, 19 years old, staring at the yellow light behind the velvet curtains until it went out completely, and he still stood there until the sky turned gray. At dawn, the door opened, and the man in a thick dressing robe looked at the young man covered in snow on his front steps with genuine surprise, as if he had completely forgotten. Then he said, "Oh, right, the money. Very well, wait while I get it." But by the time August held that money in his numb hands and ran back to the attic apartment, the apartment had fallen silent in a way no words could ever describe, and his Mila, the younger sister who had spent her whole life giving her food to someone else, had not survived that winter, slipping away while her brother was still standing on a stranger's porch, waiting for a door that wouldn't open. People said that young man sat beside her for one day and one night without saying a word, and when he stepped out of the attic apartment on the second morning, the warm hazel eyes of the Drabeck bloodline had changed into another color, the color of harbor steel in January. and inside his chest only one vow remained, that from then until the end of his life, never, never again would anyone on this earth be able to make August Drabick stand waiting before a door. And he kept that vow completely for 15 years, kept it in the cruelest way fate could imagine, by becoming the man behind every closed door in this city, by becoming the yellow light behind the velvet curtains, by becoming the one whom hundreds of people were now waiting for and pleading to, out there in the cold, across all the poor neighborhoods along the river. For 3 straight nights, after Emmett Corrigan's letter, August Drabick did not sleep. He lay in the vast apartment on the highest floor of the building overlooking the river, where everything was heated to perfection, and he stared at the ceiling in the dark and saw nothing but doors, the oak door of the stone house from long ago, the doors of an entire city left cracked open and then bolted shut, the door of the little diner in Delancey, where they had carried away the last refrigerator, and among all those doors were 2 faces that kept overlapping until he couldn't separate them anymore, the face of a young girl with hazel eyes and the face of a diner owner he had never met, but now remembered as clearly as if he had known him his whole life. "You once saved me, then you became the thing that killed me." That sentence refused to lie still. It followed him into every brief snatch of sleep, sat across from him at the breakfast table, stood behind him in the elevator, and by the 3rd night August Drabick understood that there were questions a man couldn't answer from the highest floor of a building, just as a man couldn't know how cold the river water was by looking at it through thick glass. He made no plan at all. That was the thing he would remind himself of much later whenever he remembered that night, that he hadn't calculated, hadn't arranged, hadn't weighed profit and loss as he had with every step he had taken for the past 20 years. He had simply risen after dusk, gone down to the basement where the old boxes that had never been opened again were stored, and dragged from the bottom of a wooden crate an ash-gray wool coat with both elbows worn thin, a coat from a previous life that for some reason he had never thrown away. The coat still fit. That made him stop for a moment in front of the mottled mirror in the basement, because the man in the mirror, with the frayed shouldered coat and the wool cap pulled low over his forehead, wasn't the boss of the harbor, but someone he had left far behind, someone he had thought buried with the winter when he was 19. He left his phone on the table. He left his wallet, his watch, his silver ring, left even the handgun that still lay in the drawer like an old habit, and he left the building through the back stairwell without telling anyone, stepping into the street for the first time in all those years, like a man with nothing to lose and nothing to prove, only 2 empty hands in his coat pockets and a question in his chest. From the riverfront to Delancey was a 40-minute walk, and he walked the whole distance in the deepening dark, past silent rows of warehouses, beneath the rusty iron bridge, until that street appeared before him like an old jaw. Delancey at night was a strip of peeling storefronts, leaning crookedly against one another, windows covered with plywood and plastic bags, steam rising from the ground through manhole covers in quiet white columns, as if the street itself were breathing, and above, the only street lamp still alive in the middle of the block flickered unevenly, pale yellow one moment and black the next, like a heart struggling to keep beating. Far off toward the harbor, ship horns sounded in low, muffled waves, the kind of sound that, from the highest floor from the building by the river, seemed like elegant background music, but here, in the heart of the poor street, sounded like the call of some great beast walking away. Drabick moved slowly along the block, his cap pulled low, and he looked. He looked at the 3-generation laundromat with the wooden sign worn almost blank, looked at the shoe repair shop as small as a matchbox with a yellow light still burning inside, looked at the little diner on the corner, now dark, its door pasted with a sealed notice, Emmett Corrigan's Diner, and he stood before that paper longer than any passerby should have stood. In his mind, for 15 years, places like this had existed only as ruled lines and ledgers, as debt figures and deadlines. But tonight, through the eyes of a walking man with no wallet and no name, he saw what ledgers did not record: a potted plant someone was still watering on a second-floor windowsill, a line of children's clothes strung between 2 window frames, a crooked line of white chalk on a wall drawing the shape of the sun, and all those small traces of life were like very fine needles, not hurting at once, but staying lodged inside. By the time he reached the end of the street, his legs had begun to ache. The strange fatigue of a man who had spent too long without walking on real ground, and the night wind from the river grew sharper with every gust, slipping through the worn wool coat as easily as through paper. At the end of the block stood an old church of gray stone, the kind of building left over from the days before this neighborhood had become poor, its bell tower silent for a long time, its great wooden doors shut tight, with only the row of stone steps leading up to it still intact, polished smooth by tens of thousands of footsteps from a time that had been lost. August Drabeck stopped before those steps, meaning only to sit for a moment to rest his aching legs and then return, back to the warm building by the river, back to the black silver pen, and the contract still waiting on his desk, and he sat down on the freezing stone, pulled his cap a little lower, and tucked his empty hands inside his sleeves. But then he did not get up again. There was something in the cold of the stone seeping through the thin coat, in the low ship horn drifting back from the harbor, in the flickering street lamp far down the block, something at once strange and terrifyingly familiar that held him there, and only much later would he be able to give it a name. It was the feeling of the 19-year-old boy on the stone porch long ago, the feeling of a human being sitting at the edge of the world, waiting to see whether the world would notice him. He had been sitting on those stone steps for nearly an hour when the wind from the river changed direction and turned sharp as a razor, and it was that very wind that drove him toward the first of the 3 moments he would remember for the rest of his life. About 100 steps from the church, in the empty yard between 2 rows of abandoned warehouses, a group of dock workers who had just finished the night shift were standing around a barrel fire, their faces flushed red from flame and liquor, their laughter and voices ringing through the night like a warm island in a cold sea. And Drabeck, with his feet already beginning to go numb, did what human beings have done since the beginning of time. He walked toward the fire. He meant only to stand at the outer edge, at a polite distance, to warm his empty hands in the heat spilling out, but he hadn't been still for even half a minute when a heavy-set man in the group turned and looked him over from head to toe, that gaze sweeping across the worn wool coat and the cap pulled low, then jerked his chin and said, "Go somewhere else, old man. This fire isn't burning for your kind," and another younger man laughed loudly in agreement. "That's right, old geezer. Get out of here and out of our sight. Nobody's handing out charity here. Go on, you piece of trash. Your kind. Old geezer, piece of trash." August Drabeck stood there for 2 more seconds, not because he meant to fight back, but because his mind needed exactly those 2 seconds to process something without precedent in 15 years, that someone had just said those words to him, words that, if spoken anywhere in this city together with his real name, would not have let the speaker live long enough to see dawn, and yet now they fell on him weightlessly. No one died, no one turned pale, the earth kept turning, because the man standing beside that barrel wasn't August Drabeck. He was only a torn coat with no name, and people could throw anything they wanted at a torn coat. He turned and walked away as laughter burst out behind him, and that was the first time in his adult life that August Drabeck was driven away from any place on this earth. The second moment came later, when he had returned to sit, hunched on the tall church steps, and the night had thickened around the flickering street lamp. 2 middle-aged men came out of the alley beside the church, carrying themselves like men who had just closed up their shops, one still wearing the apron of a shoe repairman, and they stopped at the foot of the steps, exactly an arm's length from where he sat, lit cigarettes, and did not even bother to glance toward the ragged shadow curled up on the stone, as if no one was there at all. Then they spoke. "You heard yet?" the man in the apron said, his voice hoarse. "They're about to scrape this whole street flat. My nephew works paperwork down at the district office and says the file's already on the desk, just waiting for old Drabeck to put pen to paper." The other man took a long drag from his cigarette, spat on the ground. "Old Drabeck." He repeated the name as if speaking of a plague. "Have you ever seen his face? Nobody has. People say he isn't human. People say his heart's a rusted lump of iron. He sits somewhere high up there pressing numbers, and down here people die like flies. Mr. Corrigan, the Halvard family at the head of the street, and soon all of us, while he doesn't even know we exist. To a man like him, what are we? Numbers on paper, that's all we are." The man in the apron nodded slowly and said more quietly, "I only hope for one thing. I hope the day comes when that man has to taste it once, just once, what it feels like to sit out on the street on a winter night and have no one even care to look at you." Then the 2 men crushed out their cigarettes, pulled their collars higher, and disappeared into the dark, never knowing that the monster they had just cursed was sitting right there, an arm's length away from them, in a torn coat, hearing every single word, and the shoe repairman's wish had already come true before he could even speak it. The third moment had no face and no voice. It was only time, the hunger that had begun scraping inside his stomach, without his knowing when, because he had not eaten since noon, the cold of the stone slab that had soaked through the thin wool all the way into his spine, and the way his body, that large body accustomed to moving through crowds with a back as straight as a mast, was changing on its own without asking his permission, his shoulders slowly folding inward, his back slowly bending, his chin drawing down into his collar, and when some pair of polished shoes passed through the pool of streetlight, he realized that his gaze automatically fell to the stone pavement, looking away, not because he feared being recognized, but because some instinct older than reason itself was teaching him the lesson every wretched soul on earth knew by heart. Don't look them in the eye. Your gaze bothers them, your existence bothers them. Only a few hours. He thought of that with a cold terror, that after only a few hours of being looked through by the world as if through a dirty pane of glass, the steelman of the harbor had already begun to bend his back, and if it were a few weeks, a few months, a few years, what would be left? He sat there as the night deepened, hungry, frozen, invisible, and inside his chest, the vague feeling that had stirred on the night he read the letter now hardened into a conclusion as sharp as ice, that this world truly was like this, cold all the way to the bottom, with no exceptions, those sitting around the fire driving away the freezing man, those about to lose their homes cursing the man above while still stepping over the man below, all of them the same. And if all of them were the same, then what fault was his? For 15 years he had only played by the rules of this world. Tomorrow morning he would go back. He decided that when the ship horn out in the harbor cried out the last call of the night. Tomorrow morning he would go back, take a hot shower, put on the suit again, sit behind the oak desk, and he would uncap the black-silver pen. And this time the nib would not stop halfway. The night had already passed into its latter half, when those footsteps sounded on the sidewalk, slow and somewhat heavy steps. Nothing like the hurried, evasive rhythm of everyone who had crossed past these steps all evening, and August Drabeck, with his chin tucked deep into his collar and his eyes already trained to look down at the stone pavement, did not lift his head. He only listened as those footsteps came closer, then slowed, then stopped altogether. He waited for them to move on like every other time before, but they did not move on. Instead, there was the rustle of fabric, the sound of a breath held back from effort, and then something unbelievable happened. Someone sat down on those freezing stone steps, right beside him, less than an arm's length away. He looked up. It was a young woman, perhaps 25 to almost 30, and the first thing that struck him was the heart-aching contrast between her thin body and the full roundness rising beneath her old coat, the belly of a mother carrying a little life, already far along inside her, perhaps 7 months, perhaps more, a living sprout pushing up that faded coat like a green shoot pushing through soil. Her face was pale under the flickering street lamp, her cheekbones slightly hollow from hunger, her dark brown hair hastily tied at the nape of her neck, with a few loose strands falling messily across her forehead. But her eyes, when she turned to look at him, were what made August Drabeck forget he was hungry. They were ash-gray eyes, tired all the way to the bottom, yet not clouded, the straight and quiet gaze of someone who had walked through many losses, without letting any of those losses teach her how to look down at the stone. He looked at her feet and saw canvas shoes split open at the toes, stuffed inside with folded layers of newspaper against the cold, the little trick of people who had no other tricks left. And he understood at once, with the eye of a man who had spent 20 years pricing human beings, that this woman was no better off than he was tonight, perhaps worse, because he only had to feed the cold of one person. She did not ask where he had come from. She did not ask if he was all right, did not look at his ragged appearance with pity, did not perform any of the rituals of charity that human beings use to lift themselves up before bending down. She only sat there, breathing herself steady again after the walk, one hand supporting the underside of her belly in the way of all mothers in this world, then placed a crumpled brown paper bag on her lap and said, her voice lightly hoarse from the cold wind but calm as if she were speaking to someone she knew. The night got cold so quickly, didn't it? You've been sitting here since this afternoon, haven't you? I passed by earlier. He did not answer. His throat, the throat that had issued orders capable of tilting the whole harbor, suddenly couldn't find a single word. The woman did not need him to answer. She opened the paper bag, slowly and carefully as if opening a gift, and from it she took out her entire fortune, half a loaf of bread still fragrant from the oven, and a small carton of milk, the tiny kind of fresh milk people bought for children. She set both things on her lap, and in that moment August Drabeck saw something that he would have missed if he had not been sitting an arm's length away from her. He saw her hand lift the milk carton, then pause midway, and her other hand, very softly, very slowly, settle over the roundness of her belly, stroking it in a small circle as if she were having a wordless conversation with the tiny life inside, as if she were whispering through her palm something he couldn't hear but somehow understood, an apology and a promise, woven together. My darling child, forgive your mother. This was meant for you. But that man has been sitting outside since afternoon. He's shivering more than you are right now. Let's offer it to him, shall we? And I'll make it up to you, I promise. The hand on her belly grew still. The woman turned toward him, broke the half loaf into 2 equal pieces with thin fingers cracked by the cold, set the larger piece on a clean bit of wrapping paper, placed the small carton of milk beside it, then held both out to him as naturally as if they were 2 friends who had eaten supper together every day, and said, "Eat this, it'll warm you up. The bread is still fresh. I only bought it this afternoon, and drink the milk too. Tonight is still very long." August Drabeck looked at the piece of bread and the carton of milk being offered to him. He, the man who owned warehouses piled high as mountains along this riverbank, the man who needed only to snap his fingers for someone to set before him meals that all of Delancey Street together couldn't afford, sat there staring at half the ration of a poor pregnant woman, unable to understand what was happening to the world, because only a few hours earlier he had already reached his conclusion about that world, cold all the way to the bottom, with no exceptions. He had sealed that sentence and meant to take it back with him tomorrow morning, along with his signature, and yet now, the exception was sitting right here, breathing white smoke into the winter night, wearing shoes lined with newspaper, and offering him everything she had. He reached out and took it, and August Drabeck's hand, the hand that had signed death sentences for so many streets without the slightest ripple, the hand that had struck a brick wall the other night without one fiber trembling, that hand was shaking now as his fingers closed around the still warm piece of bread, shaking so plainly that even he could see it. And he knew, with everything still left of the human being inside him, that it was not shaking from the cold. The woman watched him eat a few bites, and then her gaze came to rest on his right hand, the hand holding the bread, where the knuckles were still marked with splits from the night. His fist had struck the brick wall, the dried blood dark into a brown-black crust around cracks. He hadn't even bothered to wash, and she frowned slightly, not with disgust, but with the frown of someone who had just noticed a thing that needed doing. "What happened to your hand?" she asked, and without waiting for him to answer, she set her own piece of bread down on the wrapping paper, searched through the faded cloth bag hanging at her side, and took out an ivory white cotton handkerchief, old but clean, folded neatly into a careful square as if it were something precious, and in truth it was precious, because it was the last whole handkerchief she had left. "Give me your hand," she said, her voice no louder than the wind, yet carrying some gentle authority that made August Drabeck, a man who hadn't obeyed anyone's order in 15 years, hold out his hand as obediently as a schoolboy. And then he witnessed something strange. Those thin fingers, cracked by the cold, became entirely different fingers the moment they touched his hand. They moved with an unmistakable softness and precision, her thumb pressing lightly along the bones of his hand, to check whether anything was broken or fractured, the other fingers turning his wrist toward the street lamp at just the right angle. Then she dampened one corner of the handkerchief with the few drops still clinging to the lip of the milk carton, and cleaned around the cuts in spirals, from the inside outward, each movement exactly as it should be, and finally she wrapped the handkerchief around his knuckles, crossing it between his thumb and forefinger, circling back around his wrist, and tucking the edge neatly into place with one decisive motion that an ordinary person couldn't have managed even after a month of practice. The whole thing took less than 2 minutes, so skilled it was almost intimate, as if those hands were not bandaging a stranger on the church steps, but repeating something they had done before, done many times, and there was one very brief moment, so brief it nearly vanished into the dark, when she leaned closer to tuck in the last edge of the cloth, and the wind rushed past, knocking his wool cap askew, and she lifted a hand to straighten the brim for him, with the reflex of someone used to caring for others. Her fingers brushed across his left cheekbone, brushed across the old faded scar there, and her hand stopped only for 1 second, a single second like a clock hand missing its beat, then continued pulling the cap down to cover his ears as though nothing had happened. August Drabeck did not notice. He was busy looking down at his bandaged hand, at the ivory white cloth tied neatly around his knuckles, and inside him a small earthquake was taking place. One he had to spend all his strength keeping off his face, because how many years had it been since anyone had touched him like that? Not the touch of a tailor measuring a suit, or of trembling men offering social handshakes, but the touch of one human being repairing another human being, a touch that asked for nothing and feared nothing. "Are you a doctor?" he asked, and it was the first complete sentence he had spoken all night, his voice rough and hoarse from the cold, and from having stayed silent too long. The woman gathered her cloth bag and shook her head softly. "I used to be a nurse," she said, "a maternity nurse. In the maternity ward they called us the receiving hands, because we were the first hands to touch a human being when they came into this world." She paused for a moment, her ash-gray eyes drifting toward the flickering street lamp. "I did that work for 6 years, you know. For 6 years, the sentence I said most often in this world wasn't anything lofty. It was only one sentence, spoken to frightened mothers in the delivery room. 'Don't be afraid. I'm here.'" She laughed very softly, a laugh as thin as breath. "After saying it so many times, it just soaked into me, and now whenever I see someone trembling, that sentence tries to come out of my mouth all by itself." Then, as if suddenly remembering that she was sitting with a stranger and had said more than she meant to, she turned toward him, her pale face touched with an almost childlike embarrassment, and said, "I'm sorry, I'm bothering you too much. You were eating, and I went and held your hand to bandage it, and now I'm rambling besides. Please eat before it gets cold. Bothering." August Drabeck sat there with her bread in his stomach, her child's milk carton in his hand, her last handkerchief wrapped around wounds he himself had made, and this woman, who had given him all those things in less than an hour, was apologizing to him for being a bother. He wanted to say something. He did not know what. For 20 years, he had learned the language of power so completely that he spoke it like a master. But the language needed for this moment had been left somewhere very far away, in an attic apartment without a heater, so he only nodded faintly and lowered his head to finish the bread, much more slowly than before, as if trying to stretch out something he still could not name. And a very long time later, after everything that was about to happen had already happened, that ivory white handkerchief would still be there, kept smooth and flat inside the left breast pocket of August Drabeck, in the very place where people keep the things they swear never to lose, because throughout his long and endless life, among everything he had ever taken, bought, and seized, it was the first thing he had ever truly been given. They sat eating beside each other in silence for a long while, two strangers on the stone steps of a church whose bells had long gone quiet, and August Drabeck noticed one small thing that kept swelling larger and larger in his mind, that the woman ate her portion of bread very slowly, slowly with intention, breaking off tiny pieces and chewing them carefully as if trying to trick her body into believing this meal was longer and fuller than it truly was. It was a way of eating he recognized at once, because he had eaten exactly like that through an entire boyhood, the way people eat when they don't know where the next meal is. "Have you eaten dinner?" he asked, and knew the question was useless to the point of clumsiness the instant it left his mouth. But the woman only smiled, a smile without the faintest ripple of self-pity, and answered calmly as if speaking of the weather, "This is my dinner, and lunch too, really." She stopped to finish chewing the little piece of bread, then added, not to complain but as though she were only completing the story properly, "To tell the truth, these past few days I've been eating nothing but bread. 3 days now, I think. Dry bread and warm water can still get a person through a meal. Grown folks can manage somehow, but a baby can't be brushed aside that way. A baby needs nourishment, needs milk, needs decent things, so whenever I have any money, I save it to buy things for the baby first. A mother can go without, but the child is growing every day in here." She patted the roundness of her belly, her voice warming at once when she spoke of the tiny life inside her. The doctor said, "My baby is a little underweight for this stage, so I have to try. However much I can do, I'll do." She said all of it in the voice people use to talk about an ordinary day at work, without one low note asking for pity, without one pause waiting to be comforted, and it was that calmness, not the contents of the story itself, that passed through August Drabeck like a cold drill, because he suddenly understood the terrible arithmetic laid out before his eyes. That the half-loaf he had just eaten was not the spare portion of someone who had little. It was the survival ration of a mother who had gone hungry for 3 days, so she could save every coin for the child inside her. And the little carton of milk he was holding in his hand, he looked down at it, and his bandaged hand tightened. That milk hadn't been bought for her. It had been bought for the baby, with the last of her money, and she had given it to him, given it to a nameless, ragged man to whom she owed nothing, a man she did not know. "Why?" he blurted, his voice so hoarse that even he did not recognize it. "Why would you give it to me?" He turned fully toward her, looking at her directly, and for a long time, for the first time that night. "Look at me. I'm a stranger sitting out on the street. You don't know who I am. I could be any kind of man, and you're carrying a child. You've gone hungry for 3 days. You have even less than I do. This carton of milk belongs to your child." He lifted the milk carton between them, as if raising a piece of evidence. "People don't give away what they don't have. No one does that. This whole city has walked past me all evening to prove it. So why would you do it? What do you get?" The woman did not answer right away. She looked at him with her ash-gray eyes in the flickering light, her gaze not at all unsettled by the barrage of questions he had thrown at her. Then she lowered her eyes to her belly, and her hands settled there again, this time not to apologize but almost as if to introduce someone, and she said slowly, each word falling into the winter night as clearly as pebbles dropped onto still water, "You ask what I get. Look here, my child hasn't been born yet. My child hasn't opened those eyes and looked at this world even once. But do you know something? My child is already learning from me every day, from every beat of my heart, every breath I take. People say a child in the womb can feel it all. If the mother is afraid, the child is afraid. If the mother is at peace, the child is at peace. The way the mother lives is the way the child learns to live. And I have nothing to teach my child. I don't have a home to give, no cradle, not even a warm room. I have only one thing left that I can give my child as a beginning in this life, and that is the way I live in front of them." She lifted her head and looked straight into his eyes. "And I don't want, not for the rest of my life, I don't want the first lesson my child learns from their mother to be how to step past a hungry person." The wind from the river blew along the empty street, curling around the 2 small human beings on the stone steps, and August Drabeck sat there, as motionless as the stones beneath his feet. In his mind, at that very instant, everything collapsed at once without making a sound. The sentence he had passed on the world collapsed. The ice-sharp conclusion that humankind was cold all the way to the bottom collapsed. The 20 years of reasoning he had used to build the man named Drabeck collapsed, because all of it had been built on one foundation alone, that no one gives when they themselves are empty. That kindness is only a luxury for those who have enough to spare. And that foundation had just been struck down by a woman who had gone hungry for 3 days, wore shoes lined with newspaper, and taught her child from inside the womb with half a loaf of bread. He felt a strange heat rising behind his eyes, a feeling so distant that it took him a while to remember what it was, because the last time it had appeared was beside a bed in an attic apartment 15 years earlier, and August Drabeck, who had passed through purges and funerals without blinking once, the man the whole harbor believed had a rusted lump of iron for a heart, had to turn his face away, turn toward the dark street, pretending to look at the flickering street lamp in the distance, so that the woman beside him would not see what was happening on his face. The small carton of milk was drunk down to the very last drop, and when August Drabeck set the empty carton beside him with a strange carefulness, as if it were something worth cherishing rather than something to throw away, the woman shifted slightly, adjusting the way she sat to ease the ache in her back, and asked him the question no one all evening had cared to ask. "So what is your name?" That simple question hung suspended between them for a long moment, because to August Drabeck it was not a simple question at all. His name was a curse in this neighborhood. His name had just been spoken by 2 men at the foot of these very steps beside words like monster and rusted lump of iron, and something in him, something cowardly or something ashamed, he couldn't tell the difference, would not let him set that name down into the clean space this woman had just made. So he looked away and said, "My name is Anders." It was the name of an old porter who had once worked with him at the wholesale market in a life very far away, the first name that rose from the bottom of memory, and it left his mouth as dry as a counterfeit coin. The woman looked at him as he said it, looked a little longer than necessary, her ash-gray eyes resting on his face in the flickering light, and then she smiled, a small and quiet smile he could not read, and said only, "All right then, Mr. Anders." She began to gather things up, folding the bread wrapper, brushing the crumbs from her coat for the sparrows in the morning, the slow movements of someone who was about to have to stand with a body already tired and heavy. Then she braced one hand on the stone, held the other beneath the curve of her belly, and rose with a long breath caught halfway inside her. "It's going to get even colder tonight," she said, looking down at him with honest concern she made no effort to hide. "Don't sit here all night, listen to me. Behind the old fish market there's an awning that keeps out the wind. People sometimes shelter there, or try the chapel on Carver Street. They open the doors for travelers on bitter nights. You have to find somewhere to stay. Promise me. When grown folks stay cold too long, it's dangerous." And August Drabeck sat there listening to the woman who was about to lose the last shelter of her own life, warning him, the man who owned half the roofs along this harbor, that he had to find an awning so he wouldn't freeze to death. And the irony was so vast that it passed beyond mockery and became something almost sacred. "I promise," he said, and strangely enough, he meant it. She nodded, wrapped the thin scarf back around her neck, and before turning away, she looked at him one last time and said in that lightly hoarse voice, now a little warmer after the meal they had shared, "Peace be with you, Mr. Anders." Then she turned, one hand still supporting her back, and stepped down the stone stairs, the slow tilted walk of a heavily pregnant mother, passing once through the pool of streetlight before disappearing fully into the dark alley beside the row of buildings, leaving behind a silence so deep he could hear his own heart. And the woman, once she had entered the alley where the darkness covered her face, only then allowed the hand supporting her back to tremble a little. And she walked slowly, not only because her belly was heavy, but because inside her chest there was a storm that was not allowed to make a sound, because she had known from the moment her fingers brushed across that man's left cheekbone while straightening his cap, knew with a memory that did not live in the mind but in the very flesh of her hands, the memory of a craftswoman recognizing her own work, that the faded scar beneath her fingers tonight was her stitching, every single stitch, that these very hands had closed that wound on a faraway night 6 years before. And the man curled up in the torn coat on those steps, the man who had just lied to her with the name Anders, while his eyes turned away, she knew exactly who he was. She knew the real name that made this whole neighborhood shudder when it was spoken. She knew, too, what her neighbors had been whispering for weeks about the fate awaiting this strip of street. She had known all of it before she broke the loaf of bread in two, and she broke it anyway. "All right then, Mr. Anders," she had said, and kept the rest where she kept all the heaviest things in her life, behind her ash-gray eyes, where no one could see. And on the stone steps, August Drabeck sat alone for a very long time after her shadow had melted into the dark alley, his hand bandaged in white cloth resting on his knee, his gaze drifting absently along the street, toward the crooked street sign beneath the flickering lamp, the sign he had passed at dusk, without bothering to look at, and now, in the final stillness of the night, the letters on it slowly arranged themselves inside his mind. Delancey Street, and a coldness that did not belong to winter ran down the steel man's spine as he understood, late and completely, that all evening he had been sitting there eating the bread of a poor woman, on the very steps of the very street that tomorrow morning, in only a few hours, the black silver pen on his desk was waiting to wipe from the face of the earth. He returned to the building, by the river before dawn had broken, on the same legs that had carried him away, a 40-minute walk of which he could not remember a single step, because his entire mind was still sitting back there on those stone steps, and he went straight up to the apartment on the highest floor, did not shower, did not change out of the worn wool coat, only sat down in the armchair beside the great glass window overlooking the Black River, both hands resting on his knees, his right hand still wrapped in the ivory white handkerchief, and he sat that way until the eastern horizon began to thin into a pale ash color. He did not sleep, not because he was trying to stay awake, but because sleep had no place inside a man who was being taken apart piece by piece. Because through all those hours sitting there were only two images taking turns inside August Drabeck's mind, like the two faces of a spinning coin. On one side, the pale face, with ash-gray eyes, holding half a loaf of bread out to him. On the other, the crooked street sign beneath the flickering lamp. And between those two images was a question tightening slowly like a wet rope. Where did that woman live on that street? And among the 42 households enclosed inside the 16 pages on his desk, which line was she? When the morning light was finally strong enough to make things clear, he rose, went down to the office in warehouse number 7, before even the early shift guards had arrived, opened the door of the large room himself, the room still carrying the smell of the old night, and the brown file was still there, lying neatly on the oak desk beside the black silver pen, placed parallel with the edge of the paper, everything exactly as it had been 3 nights earlier, only the man about to open it was not the same anymore. He sat down, drew the file closer, and began reading again from the first page, but this time every word had changed shape. The lines that had once slipped smoothly past his eyes like a cargo manifest now dug into him one by one. Clear the area within 90 days, he read, and saw the columns of steam rising from the manhole covers like the street's own breath, and saw the sealed notice pasted crookedly across the door of Emmett Corrigan's diner. Terminate the leases with the shortest deadline the law permits. He read, and saw the line of children's clothes, strung between 2 window frames, saw the potted plant someone was still watering on the second-floor sill, saw the sun drawn in white chalk on the wall. Every clause was a shovel stroke, and he understood what he was reading. This was not a contract. This was an indictment, drafted with a neatness worthy of praise, and the man named as the accused was him. Then he turned to page 13, the residence list. His finger, the one protruding from the edge of the white bandage, rested at the top of the column and moved slowly downward, not sliding this time, stopping at every name as if stopping before every face. House number 3, house number 5, house number 9, the flower shop, the shoe repair shop, and he paused at the shoe repair shop for a beat longer, remembering the apron and the cigarette in the night. Then his finger moved on, and halfway down the page it stopped completely. Boarding house number 14. Tenant R. Voss, 27 years old, pregnant, 2 months behind on rent. He sat motionless. R. Voss, pregnant. 3 weeks earlier. This very line had made the rhythm of his reading stumble, lightly as a wheel grinding over a pebble, and he had turned the page without looking back, because then it had been only 1 line among 42 lines, 1 number in a ledger, but now, beneath the gray pale morning light of the day he had meant to sign, that line rose from the paper and took on the face of the woman who had broken half a loaf of bread for him, took on the canvas shoes lined with newspaper, took on the brown paper bag holding the entire fortune of mother and child, took on the hand placed over the roundness of her belly, stroking once in a small circle before giving her child's milk to a stranger, and August Drabeck heard inside his chest a sound he had never heard before, the sound of something very large and very old breaking. That woman had gone hungry for 3 days. That woman was 2 months behind on rent for a shabby room on the most ruined street in the city, and even that shabby room, that final shelter for her and for the tiny life inside her belly, was waiting to be crushed beneath a signature, his signature, the signature of the ragged man she had sat beside, whose hand she had bandaged, whom she had warned to find shelter before the cold soaked too deep, whom she had blessed with peace, without knowing, he thought, without knowing she was warming the very man who was about to throw her and her child out into the winter. She had given all those things to a nameless stranger. And the truth that she did not know who that nameless stranger was, in his mind now, was exactly what made all of it both sacred and impossible to bear. He looked down at page 16, where the blank line still waited at the bottom, patient and white and cold as it had waited for 3 weeks. Then he looked at the black silver pen, lying parallel along the edge of the paper, the pen that had signed sentences for more streets than he could still remember. And his right hand, wrapped in white cloth, slowly reached out, but not toward the pen. He picked up the entire file with both hands, 16 pages drafted with immaculate precision, the largest deal his organization had ever touched, the link that would move it into another tier, the future of the entire empire, and August Drabeck tore it with both hands, one long decisive rip straight through the middle, then stacked the two halves together and tore again, then tore once more, the sound of paper ripping in the silent room like ice breaking across a lake on the first day of spring. And the fragments of Delancey Street fell scattered across the oak desk, covering the black-silver pen, before it ever had the chance to be uncapped. For 4 days after the morning he tore up the contract, August Drabeck used his network for something it had never been used for in all 15 years of its existence, not to track a traitor or appraise a rival, but to learn about a poor woman who did not have a single coin in her pocket. And pieces of information came back to him in waves, through brief phone calls and thin envelopes, until, when he arranged all of them side by side on the oak desk on the 4th night, they formed a life that made the steel man sit in silence for a very long time. Her full name was Raya Voss, 27 years old, and the very first line in the report about her was already an emptiness, the section for parents and family containing only 2 words, unknown, because Raya Voss had come into this world through the doors of a public hospital on a February night and had been transferred straight into the city's care system before she was even a week old, with no letter left behind, no name to search for, and her entire childhood, he read, was a chain of moves following one another as steadily as train stops. 6 different foster homes in 18 years, families decent in the way paperwork was decent, feeding her enough, sending her to school enough, no one doing anything wrong to her, only no one ever staying long enough to do anything right, because she came and went like an object left temporarily in someone else's keeping. A few years in each place, enough to learn the name of the street, but never enough for any room to be called Raya's room. And in those papers there was one small detail the investigator had written down, almost as an afterthought, yet it was the detail that made Drabeck's hand pause the longest, that in her school record when she was 11, her homeroom teacher had written one note: "The child is well behaved and does fairly well in class. Only when the whole class wrote an essay about my birthday party, she turned in a blank page, and when asked, she said she had never had a birthday of her own, so she did not know what to describe, Mom. No one had ever waited for her to come home." That was how Drabeck summarized for himself the first 18 years of that woman's life, as he set the page down, a child growing up beneath roofs that had everything except a person standing at the window and watching for her return, a child who had never tasted the most basic feeling every human being born into this world deserved, the feeling that someone somewhere was glad she existed. And he sat there in the office on the highest floor of warehouse number 7, thinking of the attic apartment without a heater from the winter of his youth, poor, down to its last bone, but still. Every night, there had always been one person waiting for another to come home, and for the first time he understood that there was another kind of poverty in this world, quieter, one no one could see. But then the report turned the page, and Raya Voss's life bent toward the light in the way she herself had chosen, at 18, newly released from the foster system with one suitcase and nowhere to return to. She enrolled in nursing school, worked 2 jobs to feed herself and pay her way through it, and in her admissions application, preserved in the school's files, there was one answer to the question asking why she had chosen the profession, copied word for word by the investigator. "I want to work in maternity. I want to become the first person to welcome a human being when they come into this world. I think everyone who is born deserves to have someone glad that they arrived, and I want to be that person, because I know very well what it is like when that person is missing." Drabeck read that sentence 3 times. The girl no one had ever welcomed had spent her life standing at the doorway of life, welcoming others. Hundreds of children in this city had been received in the first moment of their lives by the same hands that wore newspaper inside their shoes, and he remembered the way her fingers had bandaged him on the steps, practiced and gentle, as if they had done it 1,000 times, because they truly had done it 1,000 times. The hospital's personnel file recorded Nurse Voss's 6 years of service, with good evaluations appearing steadily year after year, devoted, professionally capable, trusted and loved by mothers, with only one place that made Drabeck's eyes pause for a moment. A small technical detail the investigator had marked in pencil, with a question mark in the margin, that in the department's archived shift schedule, one night shift from 6 years earlier had somehow been erased from the system, The date still there, but every record from that night left completely blank, as if someone had reached a hand into the past and lifted an entire night out of her life. And Drabeck looked at that penciled question mark for a few seconds, not understanding, assuming it was merely some petty paperwork error from an overburdened public hospital, then turned the page. And on the next page, amid the dry-typed lines, a name stepped out: Don Voss, firefighter with station number 6. Married to Raya 4 years ago, and attached to it was a small photograph from their marriage registration file, the first photograph in the entire stack of documents in which that woman was smiling, a smile that made Drabeck almost not recognize her, radiant and unguarded, the smile of a person who, after 23 years of being passed through other people's homes, had finally found a door with someone waiting behind it for her to come back. And August Drabeck looked at that photograph for a very long time in the deep of night, knowing with the heavy intuition of a man who had read far too many files on human lives that the pages remaining beneath his hand would tell him how fate had taken that door away from her. The final pages of the file told of what remained after the funeral, and among them was one detail the investigator had gathered from an old teammate of Don's at Station 6. A detail that appeared in no official paperwork, yet it was the thing that made August Drabeck set the papers down halfway through, that when the firefighters cleared out Don Voss's personal locker at the station to bring his things home to his widowed wife, they found, among his gear and the photographs of the whole crew together, a small cardboard box still untouched, and inside it was a tiny pair of pale yellow newborn shoes, soft little shoes only slightly larger than an adult palm, along with a receipt dated many months earlier, even before Raya knew she was pregnant, and that teammate said there had been a time when the men at the station teased Dan about the box, asking who he was buying baby shoes, for when there wasn't even any good news at home yet. And Don had only laughed and said he had walked past the shop and seen how small they were and couldn't help himself, so he bought them and kept them there, because sooner or later there would be a day to use them. And so the smallest shoes in the world had waited inside the father's locker through the months when he did not yet know he was going to be a father, only to become the first and last gift he left behind for the child he would never meet. And Raya's old neighbors told the investigator that through the months after that, whenever anyone passed her apartment at night, they would see the light still burning very late. And once, when an elderly woman came by to bring food, she found Raya sitting on the edge of the bed, both hands holding that small cardboard box against her chest the way people hold a sleeping child. Behind that door, Raya Voss's life collapsed in the exact cold sequence Drabeck had seen repeated in hundreds of debtor files, except that this time he read it with one hand tightening slowly on the desk, a loss too great causing her to break down at the very moment her body most needed to be protected. Sick days following one after another, just as the public hospital began cutting staff, and the name Voss, devoted, professionally capable, trusted and loved by mothers, still landed neatly on the termination list, because spreadsheets couldn't read the human heart, and losing her job meant losing health insurance. Losing health insurance meant every prenatal appointment became a sum of money she could no longer manage. The maternity nurse who had once guided hundreds of mothers through 9 months and 10 days, now forced to feel her way through her own pregnancy with only professional memory and prayer. Then her savings ran dry, the rent on the old apartment became a mountain, and she was invited out of the little home that still carried the smell of her husband's kitchen smoke by a notice pasted on the door, until finally, after 3 moves to rooms each cheaper and worse than the last, the woman 7 months pregnant drifted into a small room in boarding house number 14 on Delancey Street, the cheapest street in the city, the place where people fell when there was nowhere lower left to fall. But fate still had one last blow saved for her, and it was delivered in the cruelest way Drabeck had ever read, through hope, because 2 days before the night on the church steps, the investigator had traced through the call log of the welfare office that Raya Voss received a phone call saying that the application for her husband's survivor benefit, the application that had been left soaking for months in the machinery of paperwork, had finally reached the last stage and was about to be approved, only waiting for a stamp. And the call center employee later remembered that the woman on the other end of the line had been silent for a long time, and then had burst into tears, crying while saying thank you over and over. Thank you, You don't know what this news means to my child and me." And that afternoon, the owner of the bakery at the head of Delancey Street said that a pregnant customer who often stood outside the glass and looked in had actually stepped into the shop for the first time, poured her last small coins, carefully smoothed flat, onto the counter, bought the best loaf of bread and a small carton of fresh milk, and smiled. The bakery owner would always remember that smile, and the woman had placed a hand on her belly and told the baby, "Today we're celebrating, my darling, it's almost over. Our suffering is finally about to turn sweet." The next morning, a printed letter arrived at boarding house number 14, stating that Mrs. R. Voss's benefit application had been denied due to a discrepancy in one detail on the form, that the applicant had the right to submit a new application from the beginning, and that the review period would be newly counted from the date of receipt, signed with a name no one could read, and just like that, with one soulless line from the machine, the lamp that had just been lit in that woman's life was blown out in a single night, and then the following evening, the evening of the most hopeless day, what Raya Voss did with the celebration loaf and the milk for her child still left in her rented room, the file did not need to say anymore, because August Drabeck knew it better than any investigator in the world. She had carried them through the dark street, had seen a ragged man curled up on the church steps, and instead of walking past him as the whole city had walked past, she sat down, broke into the celebration feast meant for mother and child, and gave him the larger piece. That was the last night she still had money. That sentence was the second to last line of the report, written by the investigator in the familiar language of accounting, balance 0 from the aforementioned point onward, and when August Drabeck read that far, he let the papers fall, did not turn on another lamp, and simply sat motionless in the darkness of the office, on the highest floor of warehouse number 7 for a long time, so long that beyond the glass window, the lights of the ships had taken their turns drifting across the whole river, because he had just understood the final arithmetic completely. That the half loaf of bread he had eaten that night had not been shared from the little a poor person had, it had been shared from the perfect 0 of a mother who had lost everything. And in this world, as it turned out, the richest person he had ever sat down to eat with was the one whose balance was 0. On the 5th morning, August Drabeck summoned Wendell Krause up to the office, and when the man stepped in with his familiar smile arriving half a second early, the first thing he saw was the torn fragments of the brown file, still lying on the oak desk, deliberately left there by the owner of the room, and Wendell's smile froze in the middle of his face like a clock whose spring had run out. "The Delancey project stops here," Drabeck said, without preamble, without explanation, his voice low and flat as the river before a storm. "Inform the partners that the deal is no longer happening, return whatever needs to be returned, and suspend all debt collection in that entire area indefinitely, starting this minute." For 3 seconds, Wendell said nothing, and in those 3 seconds Drabeck saw pass across the face of his right hand a sequence of expressions that 15 years of reading people had taught him to name one by one: shock, then calculation, then something darker than either of them sliding through the bottom of his eyes, before the polite lacquer managed to cover it again. "Sir," Wendell said, his voice still smooth, though the joints had begun to creak, "I'm afraid I may not have heard you clearly. We have gone too far to stop. The other side has transferred the deposit. The intermediaries have received their shares. This isn't a door you can close with a single sentence." And Drabeck lifted his eyes and looked straight at him, only looked, without adding a word, the look that had once made the most stubborn men on the harbor forget what they had meant to say. And Wendell Krause lowered his eyes, bowed his head, said, "Yes, I'll handle it," then withdrew, closing the door so softly it made no sound. And that perfect softness, Drabeck would later understand, should have been the first warning bell. Because 3 days later, when reports from Delancey began to come back through the layers of intermediaries, they carried with them a burnt smell that Drabeck recognized at once. The tenants in the boarding house were leaving in waves, not because of the debt calls. Those had been suspended exactly as he had ordered, but because all week-long strange men had been knocking on every door at dusk, speaking with a politeness that was frightening, reminding people that this area was about to be cleared any day now, that anyone smart would leave early, while there was still somewhere to go, because once the machines came in, they shouldn't blame anyone. Unsigned messages, that everyone understood the moment they heard them, and when Drabek traced them back, the road led straight to Wendell Krause, the man who had sold information about the deal to an outside force weeks earlier, the man now proving to both sides, to the partners that he controlled the situation, and to Drabek himself that the machine would keep running, whether you sign or not, sir, that once the tide rose, it did not wait for the man standing on the shore, even if that man was the one who had created the tide. What sent a chill down Drabek's spine was not the betrayal. Betrayal was a dish he had tasted in every flavor in this business. What made him sit in silence before the report was the blindness of the blade. Because Wendell held no hatred toward the people in that boarding house, did not even know a single face among them. To him, they were only obstacles to be moved from a square of land on a profit map. He ordered an entire building threatened the way a man sprays weeds, without aiming at any particular blade of grass, and precisely for that reason he could not possibly know, that among those sprayed weeds was a woman 8 months pregnant, to whom his boss owed a debt larger than every deal he had ever arranged. Drabek understood that on the very afternoon he understood everything else, when he broke a rule of 15 years and went to Delancey Street himself in broad daylight, passed the church steps that now sat empty in the weak sun, reached the door of boarding house number 14, and found it half open. Inside, the small room was hollow and bare, the iron bed stripped down to its old mattress, the wooden wardrobe flung open with empty drawers, and only one thing left on the windowsill, a brown plastic hair clip, and the landlady, an older woman wringing her 2 hands together, when she realized that the visitor before her was no ordinary man, told him that Miss Voss was gone 3 days ago, after the evening when those strange men came knocking along the whole row. She owed me 2 months, but I never drove her out. She arranged to leave on her own. She said she didn't want to trouble anyone. I asked where she was going, and she only smiled and said she was used to it, that she had been moving from place to place ever since she was little. Sir, are you family of hers? Poor thing, carrying a belly like that and going out into this winter. 8 months pregnant, no money, no family, not a single address left behind, vanished into the city that had stepped past her all her life, and this time because of the order of a man under his command, in the name of the empire that carried his name. August Drabek stood in the empty rented room with the brown hair clip in his palm, and the anger rising inside him was unlike any anger he had ever known. It was not hot. It was cold and transparent as new ice, and when he stepped out of boarding house number 14, he did not call a driver, did not call anyone inside the machine that had been hollowed out from within anymore. He walked straight to the parking lot, sat behind the wheel of the black car, and for the first time in all those years, August Drabek turned the key himself and drove himself into the city, searching for a person. 4 weeks. That was how long August Drabek spent searching for a woman who had left no address in a city of 2 million people. And later, when he remembered those 4 weeks, he would remember them the way a man remembers a long fever, days blurring into one another, into an endless chain of streets. Doors, shaken heads, and nights returning to the apartment on the highest floor, only to sit beside the glass window, take from the left breast pocket the ivory white handkerchief, now washed clean and folded smooth, place it in his scar-healed palm, and look at it as one looks at a question. Every night was the same, and every night, from between the folds of that handkerchief, Mila returned to him, not in the image of that final winter, but in warmer little fragments, the clear sound of her laughter like a spoon touching a glass, the thin hand pushing a plate of food across the wooden table. "I've eaten already, I'm not hungry, you eat," and he lay in the dark thinking of 2 women who had never met each other, separated by 15 years and an entire city, yet belonging to some rare breed this world did not know how to protect, the breed of people who gave away their own portion of food, and he understood why that night on the steps, when the woman broke the loaf in 2. Something inside him had recognized her before reason had time to understand what was happening, because he had once been raised by someone like that. He searched for her with everything he had, and everything he had turned out to be both vast and strangely useless. Drabek's network covered this city like the roots of an old tree, informants at every bus station, eyes in every market, doors nowhere dared close before his people, and in 15 years that machine had never failed when it needed to find a person. But for all 15 of those years it had only been used to hunt to track down debtors and traitors, people who knew they were being searched for and left behind the traces of fear. Now, for the first time, he ordered it to find someone in order to help her, and the machine stalled like a hunting animal ordered to gather flowers. His men spread through cheap rooming houses, shelters, soup kitchens, and they brought with them the only method of work they knew, knocking with their wrists, asking in the voices of men accustomed to being answered. "We're looking for a young pregnant woman, brown hair, named Voss, who knows anything." And the doors did opened out of fear. But behind those doors there were only pale faces and hasty shakes of the head. "Don't know, haven't seen her, don't know her." Even those who did know, Drabeck slowly understood with a new bitterness. Even those who might have seen her somewhere would still shake their heads, because in poor neighborhoods, people protected one another first with silence. A pregnant woman being hunted by Drabeck's men was certainly in trouble, and no one at the bottom of this city would point a hunter toward the deer. The fear he had spent 15 years sowing now rose into a mute wall right in front of him, and August Drabeck, standing before the wall he himself had built, understood for the first time a truth so simple it hurt, that fear could open every door but could not open a single heart, that a man could force an entire city to answer, but could not force anyone to tell the truth, and that the power he had traded his whole life to possess, at the very moment he needed it most for something decent, lay useless as a golden key before a door without a lock. So he changed his way. In the weeks that followed, his men received strange orders they had never heard before. Stop knocking, stop asking. Instead, go to the soup kitchens and leave money. Go to the shelters and pay in advance for empty beds. Go to the free clinics in poor neighborhoods and say that if a young pregnant woman with brown hair and gray eyes comes in for care, please don't ask anything. Just treat her as well as possible and call this number. All expenses will be covered. And Drabeck himself, night after night, drove the black car slowly through the streets his men had covered by day, the window lowered despite the bitter cold, his eyes searching every awning, every sidewalk, every curled-up shadow, looking for a slow-tilted walk with one hand supporting the lower back, and he did not find her. 3 weeks passed that way, 3 weeks of zero, and each passing day tightened the knot in his chest by one more turn. Because he could count, and anyone could count. The pregnancy had reached the 32nd week, the 33rd. That woman was running out of time somewhere out there in the harshest winter in years. And then, late in the afternoon of the 26th day, the phone call came, not from any clinic or shelter, but from an old woman who sold soup from a cart on the eastern edge of the harbor, a woman who had taken Drabeck's money to ladle hot soup for anyone who couldn't afford it. The old woman said there was a young girl with a very large belly, brown hair, ash-colored eyes, who had come to buy half a serving of soup 2 days in a row, each time standing there to eat it very quickly before walking toward the Halloran rooming house, that shabby last rooming house still lit at the edge of the water. "Sir and sir," the old woman added before hanging up, her voice sinking lower, "you should tell her family to come get her quickly. I saw her yesterday, and she looked very unwell. She was already walking so heavily." August Drabeck set the phone down and rose in that same motion, snatched up his coat, and as he drove out of the parking lot at warehouse number 7, the first wet snowflakes of the worst snowstorm that winter began slashing across the headlights, thickening with every mile toward the water's edge. The black car tore through the city like a knife cutting through a curtain of snow, the wet flakes slashing diagonally against the windshield so thickly that the wipers had to struggle through each beat, and August Drabeck leaned over the steering wheel, both hands gripping until the knuckles went white, driving faster than any reason should have allowed, on roads slowly turning to ice, crossing intersections blurred with yellow light, passing beneath the rusty iron bridge, crossing even the 15 years of his own life without once looking back. Because inside his mind, now there was only one sentence from the old soup seller, repeating over and over with the rhythm of the wipers. She looked very unwell. She was already walking so heavily. Hurry, hurry, hurry. The Halloran rooming house appeared at the water's edge like the city's last rotten tooth, 2 sagging wooden stories leaning toward the black river, a few windows still giving off a weak, murky yellow glow, and Drabeck abandoned the car in the middle of the entrance, without bothering to turn off the headlights, crossed the snow-filled yard, and slammed his hand against the front door, hard and fast, and when the door opened a crack behind a safety chain, revealing the swollen, sleep-fogged face of a middle-aged landlord. He spoke at once without greeting. "I'm looking for a young pregnant woman, brown hair, who came here a few days ago. What room is she in?" The landlord looked at the tall man covered in snow outside the door with the guarded eyes of someone who had spent his whole life at the water's edge. "What kind of hour is this to come asking?" he grumbled. "There's no one like that here. Go away." He started to push the door shut, but at that exact moment, the headlights from the car outside cut across the visitor's face, across the steel-colored eyes and the faint scar on the left cheekbone, and the landlord froze, the blood draining from his face so quickly it could be seen, because there were faces that needed no introduction, faces that people along this water's edge had only heard described in whispers, but recognized the first time they met them. And his hand trembled as he unfastened the chain, backing against the wall, his voice shifting into a different register entirely. "Last room, sir. End of the first-floor hallway. She pays by the night. I swear I don't know anything more. I swear." Drabeck had already passed him before the sentence could end. The first-floor hallway was long and dark, heavy with the smell of damp wood and kerosene, the floorboards creaking beneath his long strides. A single ceiling bulb, spreading light as cloudy as dishwater over the row of closed doors. And when he was still 5 or 6 steps from the last room, he heard it, a thin, broken sound slipping through the crack beneath the wooden door, the gasping breath of someone fighting to endure. The moan held back between clenched teeth by someone who did not want to trouble anyone, even in the most desperate hour of her life, and August Drabeck. The man who had walked through every kind of closed door in this city, without his heartbeat changing by a single measure, stopped dead before that thin wooden door for exactly 1 second, his heart pounding wildly like war drums. Then he knocked. "Miss Voss." There was no answer, only the gasping breath catching and breaking apart, and he did not wait. He turned the knob. The door was not locked. He pushed it open. The room was as small as a box, nearly as cold as outside, because the oil heater in the corner had run dry some time earlier, the only light coming from the street lamp beyond the window, spilling through glass clouded with steam. And on the floor, in the middle of that room, beside the iron bed she had perhaps tried to grip in order to stand before she could not stand at all, Raya Voss lay on her side on a thin blanket spread in haste, both arms wrapped around her belly, her brown hair fallen loose and stuck to her forehead with cold sweat, and she was in labor, many weeks earlier than her baby's due date, alone, completely alone, in a rented room paid for by the night at the city's water's edge, without a hand to hold, without a voice beside her. The woman who had spent 6 years of her life standing beside hundreds of mothers in this very hour of theirs, had held hundreds of strange hands and repeated thousands of times the gentlest spell in the world. "Don't be afraid. I'm here," now going through that very moment of her own life without a single soul in all the world to say those words to her. She lifted her head when the door opened, her ash-gray eyes widening in the dimness, first with panic, then narrowing as she struggled to see the tall figure standing frozen on the threshold with snow, still unmelted on both shoulders of his coat. And August Drabeck stood there, the man who had not known fear in 15 years, the man who had passed through purges with his pulse as straight as a ruler, standing rooted to the threshold of that miserable room and tasting, for the first time in his adult life, the full flavor of pure terror, the kind of terror that was not for himself. It surged up and took him over in 1 second, and in the next second he was down on one knee beside her, tearing off his overcoat and laying it over her body, and his voice, that low voice he used to give orders that could tilt the harbor, came out hoarse and broken. "I'm here, Miss Voss. Look at me. I've come to take you. The hospital is only 10 minutes away. Can you hear me?" And Raya Voss looked at the face bending close to hers in the yellow streetlight, the face with the faint scar on the left cheekbone, the scar she knew better than the man who carried it, and between 2 waves of effort, with the little breath she had left, she whispered a sentence he could not hear completely. Something that sounded like, "I knew it. I knew you would come," lifted her from the floor in a single motion, carefully, as if raising something both priceless and more fragile than anything he had ever held in his life, one arm sliding beneath her knees, the other supporting the whole of her thin back, and she was frighteningly light, much lighter than the round fullness of her belly would have made anyone imagine, light in the way of someone who had been giving away her own share of food for too long. Then he turned sideways through the narrow doorway, strode down the dark hallway in long steps, shoved the front door open with his shoulder, and rushed out into the snowstorm, whipping the whole sky white. Snow lashed his face, lashed the face she had pressed against his chest. The wind from the Black River surged up as if trying to tear both human beings off the earth, and Drabek bent low, shielding her with his own back as he crossed the snow-choked yard toward the car that was still running, its two beams of headlights cutting into the white blur. He laid her on her side across the back seat, wrapped the overcoat back around her shoulders, and in that moment as he bent over her, when he saw her fingers clench tightly around the edge of the seat and her breath break into short, torn pieces under a new wave of effort, something inside August Drabek came out before thought itself, passing through neither reason nor memory, rising straight from some layer deeper than the man named Drabek, and he heard his own voice say, hoarse and slow and so gentle it sounded foreign even to him, "Don't be afraid, I'm here." The sentence hung inside the car amid the sound of snow striking the glass, and he froze for half a second, not understanding where it had come from, only dimly realizing that it felt familiar in the way things feel when a man has heard them in a dream, a very old dream, from very long ago. A dream white with the smell of disinfectant in which he drifted between pain and darkness, and every time he sank, some young voice anchored him back to the world with that exact sentence. He had always believed it was a dream, because 15 years spent among knives and wolves had not allowed him to believe in anything else. But Raya Voss, lying across the back seat with her face drenched in cold sweat, had heard those words, and her ash-gray eyes opened and looked at him, and in those eyes rose something he could not possibly understand in that moment. Not surprise, but an emotion deep and quiet as the bottom of a lake being touched, because she understood, she alone in all the world understood, that the circle had just closed. 6 years earlier, on a storm-torn night in this city, they had carried a tall, unconscious man into the emergency ward with a long wound across his left cheekbone, blood already soaked through layers of his shirt, and within minutes, whispers had run down the hospital corridor faster than the medicine cart. "Do you know who this man is? He's from the harbor. Getting near him means trouble for the rest of your life." And so the space around that emergency bed slowly thinned out, the most seasoned nurses, those whose hands had grown, hardened through every kind of patient, suddenly all became busy. All had things to do in other rooms, until only one 21-year-old nursing intern remained beside the bed, a girl less than a year into the profession, not yet long enough in the work for fear to teach her how to turn away. And that girl had stayed. With her own hands, she had cleaned and stitched the wound on the stranger's cheekbone, with the first stitches of her life outside the practice room. Stitch by stitch, careful as embroidery. Then she had pulled a stool close and sat beside the bed all through that night, watching every pulse on the monitor, changing every IV bag, and each time the delirious man stirred and groaned in pain, the girl bent down, placed her hand on his arm, and softly said the sentence she had only recently learned from the head nurse in the maternity ward where she dreamed of working. "Don't be afraid, I'm here." She had said that sentence countless times through that long night to a stranger the whole hospital had avoided, and near dawn, when she left the bed for 10 minutes to hand over the shift, the man had awakened, pulled out his own tubes, and disappeared from the hospital before morning fully broke, leaving no name behind, leaving only a night shift in the records that powerful hands would later reach in and erase clean. He left without remembering her face, carrying only in the deepest part of himself a voice he believed was a dream, while she stayed behind and remembered him for 6 years, remembered the first wound she had ever stitched, remembered the first face that taught her even the most frightening men were only human beings when they lay down. And now, 6 years later, inside a car racing through the worst snowstorm of winter, that man was carrying her to give birth to her child, and returning to her, word for word and without knowing it, the very sentence she had lent him on the night he had lain on the border. "Don't be afraid, I'm here." The red lights of the emergency department appeared through the snow like a small fire. Drabek carried her through 2 sets of glass doors, and the world burst into motion, white coats rushing toward them, a gurney, a barrage of questions he answered without missing a single detail with the cold sharpness of his memory. Mother is 27, pregnancy about 33 weeks, premature labor, and then the gurney rolled away, carrying her out of sight behind the delivery room door, while he was stopped at the red line on the tile floor, Family members, please wait outside," and August Drabeck, who in 15 years had never been stopped before any door in this city, obediently stayed behind that red line, then began waiting in the hallway like millions of loved ones on Earth had waited before him, pacing back and forth beneath the white lights, sitting down in the plastic chair only to rise again, both hands twisting restlessly together, and in his right palm, without his knowing when it had happened, lay the ivory white handkerchief taken from the left breast pocket. He held it tightly as people hold a charm. The man the whole city feared standing in the hospital corridor at midnight, soaked and trembling and praying to some being he had stopped believing in when he was 19 until, after a stretch of time no clock could measure, from behind the delivery room door there came a sound that tore through everything. A baby's cry, fragile yet fierce, clear yet stubborn. The cry of a tiny life that had just stepped into this world and immediately lifted its strong little voice in defiance of all of it. And August Drabeck heard that cry pass through his chest like the final stitch, drawing the two edges of a 15-year wound closed. His steel legs buckled, and the man had to brace one hand against the white hospital wall to stay standing, his head lowered, his shoulders shaking, weeping without sound in the empty hospital at 3 o'clock in the morning. For the first time since the unheated attic apartment of 15 years before. She woke when the morning light had slipped through the gap in the recovery room curtains in a long honey-colored streak across the white tile floor. And the first thing Raya Voss saw in her new life was the clear plastic bassinet set close beside the bed, where a tiny living soul was sleeping deeply inside a pale yellow blanket, a peaceful rosy face, a little chest rising and falling steadily with a rhythm both strong and stubborn. And she lay on her side looking at her child for a very long time, afraid to blink, one hand reaching over the side of the bassinet to touch the tiny loosely curled hand, feeling the warmth of a brand new human being who had just arrived in this world, the first person on Earth who truly belonged to her, and her tears quietly soaked into the pillow while a smile rested on her lips. Then she felt someone watching her. She turned her head toward the glass wall separating the recovery room from the hallway and saw him, August Drabeck, standing on the other side of the glass in clothes, still wrinkled and stained with wet patches from last night's snowstorm, his hair disheveled, dark hollows under his eyes like a man who had stood there for hours without sleep, and on that iron face there was no iron left now, only an expression she had never seen on the face of any grown person, the expression of someone carrying something too heavy on his shoulders and not knowing where to set it down. She gave him a faint nod through the glass. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, slowly and carefully, as if afraid the sound of his footsteps might crack the room, stopping at a respectful distance from the foot of the bed, his large hands hanging awkwardly at his sides, and for a long while he could not say anything, only looked at her, then at the bassinet, then back at her, until the words he had arranged and rearranged through the long night in the hallway finally broke out of his chest, ragged and hoarse, without a trace of the voice that had once commanded the whole harbor. "Miss Voss, I have to tell you something. I have to tell you right now before I become a coward one more time. That night on the steps I lied to you. My name isn't Anders. I am," he swallowed, and his real name came out of his mouth as heavy as a sentence. "I am August Drabeck," he said, and waited for her to pull her hand back from the bassinet, waited for those ash-gray eyes to darken with fear, but she only looked at him. Silent, so he went on, more hurried now, more desperate. "You don't understand. The man you sat beside, the man whose hand you bandaged, the man you gave your child's milk to, that man is the one behind everything that fell on your street. I am the man you should have stepped past that night, like everyone else did. You fed a monster without knowing it. You," and there Raya Voss interrupted him, not loudly, only with that lightly hoarse calm voice that had once made him obediently hold out his hand on the stone steps, and she said, "I knew who you were from the moment my hand touched your face." The room fell into absolute silence, with only the tiny steady breathing from the bassinet, and August Drabeck stood there like a man whose ground had just been pulled out from beneath him, her sentence entering him slowly, word by word, like needles. "I knew who you were from the moment my hand touched your face." And in a flash he saw again the tiny buried moment from that night, the wind rushing through, the wool cap knocked askew, those thin fingers brushing over his left cheekbone and stopping for exactly 1 second. 1 second he had not noticed, 1 second into which this woman had recognized everything, had known whom she was sitting beside, had known the name Anders was a lie, had known the ragged man next to her was old Drabeck, the man her neighbors cursed, the hand suspended over the last roof, sheltering her and her child. She had known all of it, known before she broke the loaf in two, and she had broken it anyway. For the past 4 weeks, he had lived on one single comfort, that the kindness of that night had been a beautiful mistake, that she had given to him because she did not know, that if she had known, she would have run, and that belief hurt, but it could be endured because it still fit inside the framework of the world as he understood it, that people were only kind to what they did not fully know. But now that final frame had been taken away too, and the truth stood naked before him, with its full unbearable weight, that there had been no mistake that night at all, that this woman had looked straight at the monster, had silently called it by its true name, had known it was the living shape of everything that had crushed her life, and then, through a clear, conscious, complete act of choice, she had given it the milk meant for the child inside her womb. August Drabeck's knees could no longer hold him. He stepped back half a pace and lowered himself into the plastic chair beside the wall, like a tower sinking at its foundation, both elbows braced on his knees, his face buried in his hands. And the shoulders of the man the entire city feared shook in broken waves inside the recovery room flooded with morning light, because he had just understood the cruelest and most beautiful thing one human being could understand about another, that she had not fed a nameless stranger, she had fed him, fed August Drabeck, knowing full well that he was August Drabeck, and the only question left in the ruins of him, the question he lifted his head and asked her with the reddened eyes of a 19-year-old boy, who had never truly grown up, was only one word, why, and Raya Voss looked at him from the hospital bed, then turned her head to look at the tiny living soul asleep in the bassinet, and when she turned back to him, there was something in her ash-gray eyes, both gentle and unshakable, like the light of a lamp that had burned through many storm-filled nights. "You still don't understand, do you?" she said softly. "I stitched that face back together with my own hands, Mr. Drabeck. People don't abandon what they once helped make whole." 3 days later, when Raya Voss had been moved to a regular hospital room, and the tiny living soul in the bassinet had learned to open eyes the same ash color as her mother's, and look at the world with strong, curious alertness, August Drabeck returned to the hospital, and this time he came in his familiar dark suit, clean-shaven, his hair neatly combed, but anyone who had known him 1 month earlier would have recognized at once that something had changed at the very root of that man, the way he knocked and waited to be invited in before entering, the way he sat on the edge of the chair instead of occupying it, and most of all his eyes, those steel-colored eyes that had warmed by a few degrees in the way steel only warms after it has passed through fire. What mattered was that throughout the whole meeting, he did not take out a check, not an envelope, not a single offer that had anything to do with handing over money, and that was no oversight. It was something he had turned over in his mind through 3 sleepless nights, because deep inside August Drabeck there still remained, intact, a 19-year-old boy who had once stood through an entire winter night before a brightly lit door, who had tasted all the way to the bottom what it meant to wait for another person's mercy, to beg, to owe, and that boy had sworn to himself among the snowflakes long ago that if the day ever came when he gave something to someone, he would give it in a way that meant the receiver would never have to stand outside on a porch, never have to hold out a hand, never have to say thank you in humiliation. And 11 years earlier, he had done exactly that once, with the hospital fees of a woman named Nora whom he did not know given, and then forgotten, given as if the giving had never happened. So today, before the woman who had saved him twice in his life, he could violate that vow even less, could not turn her into someone indebted to him, and he had prepared something entirely different. "Miss Voss," he said, placing on the table not money but a thin stack of papers, "I've come to offer you a job." He spoke in the voice of a man discussing serious business, not the voice of someone bestowing favors. "Your old hospital is willing to take you back as a maternity nurse whenever you want. That would only take 1 phone call from me. But there is a second option." He pushed the papers toward Whither. "This is the draft plan for a community clinic on Delancey Street. Free care for pregnant women and young children throughout the Harbor District. I will fund its construction and keep it running, and I want you to lead it. Not because I owe you, but because in my life I have never met anyone born to do that work the way you were." Raya Voss looked at the papers on the table for a long while, the sketches of a clinic drawn on the ground of her own street, a dream that, in another life, she would have taken in both hands and wept over. Then she looked up and shook her head. "I can't accept this, Mr. Drabeck," she said, her voice still gentle, though every word stood upright, and before he could react she went on. "Please don't misunderstand me. It's a beautiful thing, perhaps the most beautiful thing anyone has ever offered me, but I know where the money that would build it comes from. This whole harbor knows. It comes from interest that breaks people's backs, from refrigerators carried away, from families like Mr. Corrigan's." She looked straight into his eyes. "And you're asking me to stand inside a house built from bricks like that, welcome the children of this neighborhood into the world there, and then go home at night to raise my own child on wages from it? I can't. I would rather go back to eating dry bread than raise my child on something that has taken away other people's roofs." The room fell silent, and August Drabeck sat there, looking at the woman who had just refused the entire future of herself and her child because of a principle this whole city had sold cheaply long ago, and a dry, brief, painful laugh broke from his chest, not laughing at her, but at himself. "Do you know what the funniest thing is?" he said, his voice sinking until it was almost a monologue. "That night on the steps, you gave me half a loaf of bread when you didn't have a single coin left in your pocket, gave it without calculation, without condition, without needing to know who I was. And he opened his large hands and looked at them. I have warehouses piled high as mountains, an empire running along this riverbank, and yet in 15 years, I have never given anyone anything without taking back twice as much. Not once. Look at that." He lifted his eyes, and in them was a question so honest it was almost bare. "So between the two of us, who is truly rich, and who is the ragged beggar?" Raya was silent for a moment. Then she did something he did not expect. She smiled, tired but warm, and said, "You're still asking the wrong question, Mr. Drabeck. You keep trying to find a way to repay me, but I never lent you anything. That half loaf was given freely. It was finished that night, and if you're truly asking what I want..." She turned her head to look at the bassinet beside her, where the baby slept with one tiny loosely curled hand resting near the cheek. "Then I want only one thing, and that can't be bought with any clinic or any empire. I don't need you to give me money. I need you to become a man whose name I can say one day when my child grows up and asks, 'Mama, who carried you to the hospital on the night I was born,' without having to lower my face. A man my child can speak of without the fearful whisper this whole neighborhood still uses when it says your name. If you can do that, then every debt in the world between us, if there ever was one, will already be paid." August Drabeck sat motionless for a very long time after those words, looking at the mother and the child in the slant of afternoon sunlight slipping through the curtain. Then he gave one very slow nod, gathered the papers back, rose to his feet, bowed his head to her with an old-fashioned solemn courtesy he himself did not know where he had learned, and walked out of the room, down the hospital hallway filled with sunlight, down the stairs, out to the black car parked beneath the bare trees, and there, beside the open car door, August Drabeck, the man who for 15 years had never woken for a single day, without knowing exactly what he would do, what he would conquer, what he would crush, stood still in the clear winter afternoon, and for the first time in his entire adult life, he had absolutely no idea who he was supposed to become tomorrow. In the weeks that followed, the port of Philadelphia witnessed a phenomenon that no one, from the oldest informants to the sharpest rumor brokers, could possibly explain. Drabeck's empire began to take itself apart, quietly and in order, like a great ship unloading its own planks onto the dock one by one. The lending networks across the poor neighborhoods were shut down in turn. Debts that had bent people's backs were erased in waves, through brief phone calls that left debtors standing motionless in their homes with receivers in their hands. Properties that could be returned were returned to the very hands that had lost them, and what remained was gathered into a fund under the names of transparent managers, over whom Drabeck himself held no control. And it all happened quickly, neatly, decisively, because the man dismantling the machine was the very man who had built it, the one who knew where every bolt of it lay. But August Drabeck was not naive. 15 years spent among knives and wolves had not allowed him to be naive. He knew very well there was one problem every act of leaving the underworld ran into, and where most of them broke, that a person could leave the underworld, But the underworld did not leave that person. Wendell Krause was still out there, had formally turned against him, and was now serving the force to whom he had sold information. And that force still hungered for the Delancey strip of land, the way the tide hungered for the shore. They had smelled weakness. They understood that the alpha wolf of the harbor was breaking off his own teeth, and the moment Drabeck let go completely, they would flood in and finish what he had left undone. Then there would be no one standing between the bulldozers and the street with those church steps anymore. He could fight them, of course, the old way, with blood and iron. But doing that meant becoming the monster again, in order to protect the people he wanted to become worthy of. A vicious circle he had seen all the way to its bottom through his sleepless nights. And so August Drabeck came to the final move, the only move Wendell Krause and men like him could never, even in dreams, have anticipated, because in their world there was no precedent for it. No boss in the history of the harbor had ever done such a thing willingly. On an early spring Tuesday morning, as the ice on the Delaware River began cracking into large sheets that drifted toward the sea, a tall man in a gray overcoat walked alone through the doors of the federal building downtown, gave his full name to the duty officer who stood there with his mouth open, and set on the desk not a briefcase full of money but 3 boxes of files, 15 years of records from an entire underground empire, names, routes, money flows, and evidence incriminating even himself, all arranged so neatly that prosecutors would later admit they had never seen a case surrender itself so completely. He did not bargain for innocence. He did not hire wizard lawyers to twist and deny everything in circles. He set only one condition in exchange for his complete cooperation: that the entire network of Wendell Krause and the force behind him be torn out by the roots, that Delancey Street and the poor harbor neighborhoods be placed beyond the reach of any remaining black hand. He traded the only thing he had left that still belonged to him, his own freedom, to buy permanent safety for a street he had once meant to erase, for a woman and a child to whom he owed more than any language could hold. And it must be said plainly here, as he himself said plainly before the court, that this was not a fairy tale where remorse could erase guilt. No such miracle exists. What August Drabeck had done over 15 years was real. The ruined families were real. Mr. Emmett Corrigan was real. And justice, while acknowledging his cooperation and the mitigating circumstances, still sentenced him to many years behind bars. He listened to the sentence with a calm face, bowed his head, and accepted it the way a man accepts a debt come due, because he understood what very few men seeking redemption understand, that redemption is not having the debt wiped away. Redemption is beginning to repay it, and Delancey Street lived. It lived in a way even the street itself did not understand. The bulldozers never came. Instead, workers came to repair leaking roofs and replace rotted window frames with money from a fund whose origin no one fully knew. The 3-generation laundromat hung up a new sign. The shoe repair shop replaced its yellow lamp. Families who had left in fear slowly came back, one after another, and on the empty lot beside the old church, people broke ground on a community clinic for pregnant women and young children throughout the harbor district. Hundreds of families were thus given back their roofs and their futures, without a single one of them knowing, and perhaps they would never know, that all of it had begun on a winter night, with half a loaf of bread broken in 2 on a cold stone step. Raya Voss alone knew. And when the fund managers came to her with an invitation to lead that clinic, she asked only one question: does this money still owe anyone tears? And only after reading every page herself, only after confirming with her own eyes that the water had been made clean through the price paid by one human being, did she nod and accept the work. The maternity nurse returned to her white coat, carrying her child each day to the clinic that still smelled of fresh plaster, on the very street that had almost crushed them both. And so, amid the first busy and peaceful days of her new life, Raya Voss raised her child, welcomed the children of the harbor into the world, and began to wait. Waiting in the quiet way of a woman who had learned how to wait for things worthy of waiting for, waiting for the day when the man paying his debt in a faraway place would walk out through the final door, so she could tell her child, without lowering her face, about the man who had carried her mother through the snowstorm on the night she was born. 3 years later, on a clear winter morning when pale sunlight lay over the thin first snow like a layer of fine sugar, the iron gate of a gray building on the western outskirts of the city opened, and August Drabeck stepped through it with a plain cloth bag over his shoulder, wearing the simple charcoal coat issued to those who had completed the first stretch of their sentence and been granted conditional release. 3 years. 3 years of such complete cooperation that the prosecutors themselves had stood before the board to confirm it. 3 years in which, thanks to his boxes of files, Wendell Krause's network and the force behind him had been torn out to the last root, and now that man stood outside the gate, drawing in a long breath of his first free air, his hair much grayer at both temples, his face thinner and its lines softened in the way stone softens after water has run over it long enough, and he did not call a car toward downtown, did not go back toward whatever remained of his old life. He boarded the bus heading toward the harbor, got off at the final stop, and walked the rest of the way, like a pilgrimage, toward the street called Delancey. The street greeted him with a face he both recognized and did not recognize. Storefronts repainted in warm patches of color, the laundromat hanging a new wooden sign engraved with the same old words, the shoe repair shop glowing with its yellow lamp, while the old cobbler in his apron bent over a stitch by the window. Steam still rising from the manhole covers like the street's own breath, only now it breathed amid the sound of people calling to one another, children's bicycles, and a morning bread stand, and at the end of the street, the old stone church still stood with its silent bell tower, except the stone steps had been repaired until they lay smooth and even. Green potted plants set on both sides, and above the great wooden door now hung a white sign painted with simple blue letters, Delancey Community Clinic, free care for pregnant women and young children, because people had chosen that very place, those very steps, as the doorway of new life, and August Drabeck stood silently at the street corner, looking at it for a long while, his hand inside his coat pocket gripping a familiar soft object, the ivory-white handkerchief that had followed him through 3 years behind bars, folded smooth and flat in the left breast pocket, exactly as it had always been folded. And then he saw them, on the stone steps, where 3 years earlier a ragged man had sat curled up waiting for the world to see him. There now stood a woman in a moss-colored wool coat, her brown hair neatly braided, her face full and rosy again, while her ash-gray eyes were still the same, still direct and clear, and beside her, toddling up and down the lowest stone steps in little yellow boots, was a boy of about 3, his cheeks reddened by the cold wind, sturdy and round in his blue puffer jacket, laughing brightly each time he conquered a step as though it were the highest mountain in the world. Raya Voss saw him first. She straightened, did not wave, did not call out, only looked at him across the street, with a slow smile blooming like sunrise, the smile of someone whose waiting had just been rewarded. Then she bent down and said something softly to the boy, pointing toward him, and the boy turned his head, squinting for 1 second at the tall stranger in the charcoal coat, only 1 second, and then, as if inside that small blood there lived some compass already set on the snowstorm night he could not remember, the boy broke into a wide grin, lifted his short little arms into the air, and ran across the sidewalk on wildly unsteady 3-year-old legs, straight into August Drabeck, and that man dropped to one knee on the thin snow just in time to catch the boy fully in his arms, to feel those tiny arms loop around his neck, to hear beside his ear a peal of laughter as clear as a spoon touching a glass, the sound he had spent 15 years waiting to hear again, and the boy tipped his head back to look at him, declaring in the bright, proud voice of a 3-year-old, "Sir, Mama said we have an honored guest today. Are you the honored guest and August Drabeck?" The man who had once made the whole harbor hold its breath nodded to the boy with absolute solemnity, his voice turning hoarse. "Yes, I've come to visit you. Haven't you grown so big?" A little later, when Raya had gone back, inside, for the morning appointments and the boy had been led by the assistant to play with building blocks in the corner of the waiting room, Drabeck stood outside the clinic's large glass window and looked in, and he saw her, Raya Voss in her white coat, sitting on a low chair before a homeless old man the staff had just helped in from the cold, an old man curled in on himself, with cracked fingers trembling from the winter, and from the shyness of someone who had grown far too used to being driven away, and he saw her take those 2 hands and warm them between her own, saw her bend down to meet the old man's evasive eyes with the patience of her ash-gray gaze, and though there was a pane of glass between them, August Drabeck could still read the full shape of that sentence on her lips, the sentence she had been saying all her life, the sentence that had twice drawn him back from the edge, "Don't be afraid, I'm here." He stood there for a very long time, his breath fogging the glass in a thin veil, his hand still holding the ivory-white handkerchief inside his coat pocket. Then he stepped back and looked down at the stone steps beneath his feet. Those slabs worn smooth by tens of thousands of footsteps. The place where 3 years earlier the poorest woman in the city had sat down beside the richest man in the city and taught him again, from the beginning, the meaning of being human, and standing on that very threshold in the clear winter morning, hearing a child's laughter ringing out from behind the door, August Drabeck understood the final thing, the thing that had taken 3 years behind bars and a whole lifetime before that to understand, that he had not been forgiven. What he had done still remained, and remained like the scar on his cheekbone that would never fully fade. No, he had not been forgiven. He had been given a chance, and those were two entirely different things, because forgiveness was something a person received in order to feel lighter, while a chance was something a person had to pay for, with every day left in his life. And when the clinic door opened behind him with the pattering footsteps of a 3-year-old running to find the honored guest, that man turned, knelt down with his arms open, began to pay. People say that on blackout nights along the harbor, when the whole stretch of riverbank sinks into darkness, the first thing people see is not the giant floodlights on the cranes, now gone completely dead, but a small candle someone has lit behind a window, because the thicker the darkness becomes, the less light needs to be large in order to be seen, and the story of August Drabeck and Raya Voss, in the end, is the story of such a candle, the story of the night when an entire well-fed city with tens of thousands of blazing lights walked past a man curled up on a stone step, and the only person who stopped, the only one who still had enough light within her to see a human being inside that heap of torn clothing, was a woman burning with the last drops of wax in her own life. And that is the first thing this story wishes to leave with us. That compassion has never been something people practice only after they have plenty. Because if that were true, the richest people would be the kindest people in the world. No, compassion is what defines us at the very moment when we have nothing left. Half a loaf of bread from a mother who had gone hungry for 3 days weighs more than an empire stretched along the riverbank, because it was given from zero. And what is given from zero can no longer be measured by any unit this world possesses. As for August Drabeck, as for those 15 years of that man's life, perhaps no image is truer than the very tide of the river he once ruled. Power is exactly like high water. It rises smoothly and sweetly, lifting a person higher and higher off the ground, and as it rises, it quietly washes away every memory of the shore, of the time when we still stood below, still knew cold, still knew hunger, still knew what it meant to stand all night before another person's door. The higher the tide rises, the blurrier the shore becomes, until one day the man standing on the crest of the wave can no longer remember who he once was, and only when he runs aground, only when he is thrown back onto the cold earth in a torn coat, does everything suddenly come back. And that is why empathy, at its deepest, is not a virtue people train themselves to possess, it is memory. The kindest people in the world are often those who remember most clearly what it feels like not to be seen by anyone. Raya Voss stopped beside those steps, not because she was nobler than the whole city, but because she remembered in her very flesh, every stray strange roof, every essay turned in as a blank page, every year when no one had ever waited for her to come home. She saw that invisible man because she herself had lived her whole life inside invisibility. And then there remains the last thing, the most beautiful thing, about stitches. There are people in this world who carry a strange calling. They mend others without needing to ask whether that person deserves it. The 21-year-old intern long ago stitched the face of a man the whole hospital avoided, stitch by stitch, careful as embroidery, not knowing and not needing to know whether she was making whole a human being or a monster. And that stitch had to wait 6 long years before it truly healed on the night when the man who carried it lifted his benefactor and ran through the snowstorm. Because as it turns out, there are wounds that close in one night, but need many years and an unchanged heart before they heal all the way to the bottom. People don't abandon what they once helped make whole, she said. And perhaps that is the simplest definition of humanity we can carry with us, that no one in this world is so worthless that they do not deserve to be seen. Not even the person curled up on the steps while the whole street walks past. and no one is so lost that they cannot be redeemed by one act of kindness. Not even the man the entire city believed had a rusted lump of iron for a heart, because sometimes all a soul frozen for 15 years needs is half a loaf of bread broken in two by a hand that does not tremble in fear. So if tomorrow, on your way to work or school, you come across someone the whole stream of people is passing by as if passing a stain on the sidewalk, please slow down for one moment. You don't need to have much. This story has proven that the one who gives the most may be the one who has the least. Sometimes all it takes is a look that recognizes them as a human being. A question of concern, a small act of sharing. Because you never know what your little candle may light. Perhaps it will only warm one person for one night. And that alone is already more than enough, but perhaps, like half a loaf of bread on Delancey Street, it may save an entire street, change an entire fate, and become the first lesson a child carries into life. Our story closes here, and if it has touched some corner of your heart, we sincerely hope you will press the subscribe button, like, and share this video with the people you love, so that each day we may continue listening together to more meaningful stories about human kindness. And above all, we want to hear from you yourself. How did this story make you feel? Which moment left you silent the longest? Have you ever stopped for someone, or has a stranger ever stopped for you? Please write your feelings from deep within your heart in the comments, because it is your very words of sharing that keep this channel warm through every video. Thank you for staying with the story until the very last minute. We wish you and your family good health, a joyful life, and peace and serenity every day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.